we can begin. Thanks, Marie, for that recording. So I want to welcome everyone here today and say good afternoon, and that we are coming together virtually from across Mi'kma'ki, the unceded, ancestral, and current home of the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet people. I'm privileged to be welcomed to live and work and play on these lands, which are covered under the treaties of peace and friendship. We also recognize there have been African Nova Scotian and Acadian communities here for 400 years as well. And we acknowledge that we are all treaty people. We are coming to the end of this webinar series, which we are able to offer through funding and collaboration with Labor, Skills and Immigration. And we're recording this webinar, and it will be available on the LNS Resource Hub for a short time for anyone who would like to revisit it or who misses it today. And so we are very privileged to have Tammy Williams here today for our webinar on decolonizing education through Indigenous traditional knowledge. And Tammy Williams is a Mi'kmaq grandmother from Sipekneka'tik First Nation and is the Education Programs Manager at the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center and a professor at St. Mary's University. And I'll let Tammy take over. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. So hello, everybody. I'm going to pull up some slides, and I'm going to ask that we hold the questions until I go through everything. And then once we do, I'm going to open it up for conversation. So rather than a question period, I'd just like to open up for a talk where we can discuss what it was that you learned and ask any questions. And then maybe I can offer some clarification or context to some of what I'm going to talk about. So I'll start off by introducing myself. So Gwen Nindelawisi Tammy Williams, hello, my name's Tammy Williams. I'm from Halifax. My family is from Sipekneka'tik or Sipekneka'tik First Nation. I am a mother and a grandmother, and I'm helping to co-parent my granddaughter with my younger daughter while she's attending university. I'm a graduate of the Women and Gender Studies program at SMU, and I've been engaged in this particular area of decolonizing education and research for quite a few years, although I didn't exactly know that that's what it was called. It didn't have a title when I first started this kind of work and research. I've been working as a cultural advisor on and off for many years in a number of different organizations, as well as working in strategic planning and change management. So wherever I found an opportunity that I could actually integrate new ways of looking at things in Western organizations, I've tried to integrate those along the way. I've also been working on the transfer of knowledge for quite a long time too. And when I say transfer of knowledge, I mean learning and teaching. And we do that traditionally through storytelling. So I've been really privileged growing up. Even though I grew up down in the States, I come from a very traditional family, and the stories were always being shared. So I was really, really grateful when I did move here and become a part of the DETITK community, that I had that background, because it really helped to inform me of who I was as a Mi'kmaq person. So I just want to say thank you so much for having me here today, to provide you with this opportunity to talk about this and increase your knowledge around what is decolonizing, what is Indigenous traditional knowledge, even if you're not familiar with it already. And I also want to talk a little bit about the differences between decolonizing, anti-colonizing, and allyship in educational institutions, including our CLOs. So this is what I'm going to be discussing today. So I'm going to get right into the heavy stuff. What is colonization? So according to Oxford Dictionary, it's the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the Indigenous people of an area. Now, contextually, what that did was it led to the marginalization of Indigenous people, and it's had impacts on health, language, socioeconomic welfare, healthcare, culture, and education. There is a Western bias and control over academic research and over academia in general. And it's something that, as I continued to go through my studies, it became a real passion project for me. And I wound up doing my thesis in this specific area of decolonizing Indigenous research. One of the main things that was used in colonization, and not just in Canada or the United States, but in other places as well, is the use of residential schools. So when I first put these slides together, I was going through it today and I had to update the numbers on here. The first time I wrote this, there were over 2,000 children found in unmarked graves. We are now at over 7,000 children that have been discovered in unmarked graves. The picture that you see on the slide here are the 2,800 names that were actually identified and memorialized in Ottawa on September 30th of 2019. So the unmarked graves that they're finding now are actually on top of the 2,800 that were already identified. So that's a lot of children. The first people that were actually the guinea pigs of residential schools were actually Celtic tribes when they were being colonized by the British Isles. So the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scots. And although they were Christians, they retained sufficient political autonomy and enough of their own traditions, such as their language, clan systems, dress, or etc., to provide an excuse for their systematic pacification. And that was done through these schools, quote unquote schools. They were institutions where those teachings that they grew up with traditionally were actually removed. So after being tested in the British Isles with the Welsh and the Scots and the Irish, those residential schools were used in other areas of the world, fully, being fully aware that they were successful in what they were doing. The destruction of the tribal societies through these schools were so successfully suppressed that many of the descendants of even Scots and the Welsh have no idea why they are the way that they are, or why they're living where they're living. And they've established intergenerational effects in their own societies as well. So it's not just Indigenous people who have, or Canadian Indigenous people who have been colonized through the use of residential schools. By the time they got here, they were already proven to be effective. And that's a bit of history that I thought was really important to point out, that it wasn't an experiment when they came to Canada. It was already something that had been proven to exist and to work in other societies. That's a pretty damning fact when you think about, well, we were just trying to do what we thought was best. It's like, no, actually, if you look at the history books, and I got this information from a book called The Circle Game by Ronald, oh my goodness, it's in the bibliography. Christian, that's his name, Roland Christian. It's a very, very good book. So if you have an opportunity to read that, it's a great look at the history of the schools and the impacts even prior to settling in Turtle Island. So why I've really delved into this type of research really comes from the acknowledgement and the learnings that I underwent around the systemic racism, positional superiority, and mostly the indoctrinated Westernized methods of research and transfer of knowledge. The Western systems have actually created gatekeepers for Indigenous people that not only prevented them from attending a education system that was balanced and equitable, but it actually kept them from even going to schools where that was being offered, right? And then when they did want to go to those schools, they had to do so knowing that they were going to have to give up their status and the acknowledgement that they were Indigenous people. So as an example of that, my great aunt, Isabel Knockwood, went to residential school. And when she got out, she wanted to keep pursuing her education. So she went to school for nursing. However, when she graduated, she was given a choice. She could either accept her diploma and become a nurse, and she would have to give up her status as an Indigenous person to do so, meaning she could not go back to her community, or she could leave behind all of that education that she had acquired. She chose to leave behind her nursing education, so she never did get to actually practice nursing, even though she was trained and had the education for it. Some of the other things that really motivated me to delve into this were the gaps in education between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and the lack of equity within academia. So if you go into St. Mary's, there are 2 Indigenous professors there. I'm one of them. But when I approached the administration with a proposal to do a cluster hire of Indigenous people so that we could establish a Indigenous studies program that actually offered degrees in both undergrad and graduate programs, I was told that we don't do cluster hires. And I stood there and I looked around and I went, well, actually you do, right? You just don't do cluster hires for minorities. So there's a gap there in education. There's a gap in equity in academia. There's also a devaluing of ITK, or Indigenous traditional knowledge, that has happened historically. And now we're getting to a point where they're actually starting to see the value of Indigenous traditional knowledge. And we're looking at how do we build that relationship back up again in order to be able to say, how do we work together to acknowledge what Indigenous people have known throughout history to be of value when it comes to things like medicine, environment, sustainable practices in fisheries. All right, that's a big one today. And how do we work together with that? So part of the research that I've done is on building that relationship back up. The lack of equitable inclusion throughout history has actually led to Western biased views of Indigenous peoples and their values to society. So all of these things added up and just kept pushing me to go further and further down this path. And then there's a very generalized interpretation of what Indigenous means. So when we use the word Indigenous, we're talking about Indigenous people who were native to the lands where their ancestors came from. But that doesn't mean that as a Mi'kmaq grandmother, I have the same beliefs as a Mohawk grandmother or a Navajo grandmother. We've been placed under this umbrella so much so that when we talk about conducting Indigenous research, we've actually just painted everybody with the same brush and said, well, you're Indigenous, so you must believe in this, 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 and this. It's like, well, actually, there's intersections to what we believe in based on how we were raised, where we were raised, what our cultural customs, mores, norms, and values are. But they've been replaced with Western ones. So it's delving deeper into who we are as individual nations to find that information. So what is decolonization? So decolonization is an act that it helps Indigenous people to restore their own Indigenous worldview. It's making space for Indigenous people to say, yes, we are different. We have our own worldview. Personally, I see things as a very holistic worldview where everything is interconnected. In Mi'kmaq, we have a phrase, "Msitnogama," meaning all my relations. And all my relations doesn't just mean myself and my mom or my cousins or even second cousins. It also means my relations with the land, with the animals, with the trees, with the sky. So everything is related. It's a very holistic worldview. Decolonization helps to restore culture in traditional ways. And it also replaces the westernized interpretations of history with our own Indigenous perspectives of history. So when I was growing up, my mom used to tell me, the winners write the history books. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all fact-based. It just means that that's what the winners decided to put in the book. We need to look at the other perspective in order to decolonize. So decolonization actually requires non-Indigenous Canadians to recognize and accept the reality of Canada's colonial history and accept how that history paralyzes or paralyzed Indigenous people and how it continues to subjugate them. Decolonization for non-Indigenous individuals, governments, and institutions requires that they start making space and support for Indigenous people to reclaim what was taken from them. There's another term I want to bring up that's used very, very frequently, and it kind of, it makes me cringe a little bit because it's, again, painting everybody with the same brush, and that's indigenization. So indigenization requires validity of Indigenous worldviews, knowledge, and perspectives. It identifies opportunities for indigeneity to be expressed, and it incorporates Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. But again, if an institution says we're going to indigenize the curriculum, what exactly does that mean? Are they going to, if they're in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq-ize it? If they're in Ontario, are they going to Mohawk-ize it? Right? So what is indigenization? It's that blanket term that places us all at that same level of beliefs. And that's why it kind of makes me cringe a little bit, because we are very individual nations. From a non-Indigenous perspective, indigenization requires non-Indigenous people to be aware of Indigenous worldviews. And I use the plural in that because I've changed the definition slightly, because we all have different worldviews. So it's just, when we use those terms, or when I hear those terms being used within academia, I always think that we need to acknowledge that there's not just a homogenous Indigenous worldview, that each nation or community is going to have their own worldview. And depending on where you are within that nation, there's a very different way of looking and doing things if you are living in community or if you're in an urban area. So if I was in Sipekneka'tik, I might have a different worldview and a different way of looking at things than living here in Jabukduk. And that needs to be acknowledged when we are going through these curriculum changes and we're saying we're going to indigenize this. What exactly does that mean? Which worldview are you pulling from? So decolonization, excuse me, decolonization requires non-Indigenous Canadians to recognize and accept the reality of Canada's colonial history and accept that history has paralyzed Indigenous peoples, and to identify how it still continues to subjugate Indigenous peoples. But there's another term I wanted to talk about, and that's anti-colonization. And when I was doing this research, the one country that kept popping up when I would do searches on anti-colonization was India. And India, when they decided that they were going to say no more British rule here, they took a very anti-colonization approach, because anti-colonization, when you are going back to what you were prior to colonization, you have to make sure that you don't just replicate the Western ways of doing things. So it's not just saying, well, we're going to get rid of the Western president or prime minister. We're going to go back to our traditional form of governance. So it's really going back in time to say, what did we believe in before colonization? And moving forward from that direction. And I want to read something. Now, this comes from a book called The Wretched of the Earth by Fanon. So Fanon considers the merits and harms of violent response to colonial rule, which is in itself always violent at both psychological and physical levels. And although physical violence will likely result in national independence and therefore might be necessary, Fanon argues that it'll only replace European leaders with African leaders rather than abolish the hierarchy and the nervous conditions that colonialism creates. Fanon argues that the third world must endeavor to create a new man that will refuse to replicate the European injustices with new faces and instead envision alternative ethics, politics, and aesthetic protocols for a more egalitarian world. So if we were to look at what Fanon is saying, it's not about just replacing the people in those positions. It's about replacing the system that's there. And something else I wanted to point out too, I had a question just this morning, as a matter of fact, around allyship. So one of the professors at Dal said, I was told that being an ally doesn't mean just writing a shirk grant for 5 years worth of funding and then disengaging from the community when we're done. It requires being physically present. And I had to argue with that a little bit, because sometimes we can't be physically present. Just because somebody's not able to pick up a hammer or to attend specific meetings, like perhaps they have some physical mobility issues, that doesn't mean that they're not allies. But if they're in a position where they can create space, then they can become allies. So allyship, it's not always about physical labor, and it isn't always about intellectual labor. It's about creating opportunities for Indigenous voices to be heard from an equitable position that has been systemically stripped from them through colonization. So what is ITK? So Indigenous traditional knowledge, and this is a quote from Leanne Simpson, who wrote a book called As We Always Were, which really kind of changed my life when I was going through my master's program. Indigenous knowledge is the primary source of strength Aboriginal peoples have to resist the further colonization of our lands and our minds, and to build strong, sustainable nations, and to dream and envision a better future for our children and our relations in the plant and animal world. Our ancestors sacrificed, suffered, and worked hard to maintain our cultures in the past, and that responsibility is now passed on to us. So if you think about Indigenous traditional knowledge from that perspective, it is passed on generationally. So when we learn from our parents and our grandparents and our great-parents, once we learn those lessons, we become responsible to pass that on to the next generations. And that's how our oral histories have survived throughout colonization. That's how we as Mi'kmaq people still know who we are, even though we were the point of first contact when colonizers came to North America or to Turtle Island. and we've lost the most through the most sustained presence here, we still maintained our oral histories. And throughout colonization and the Indian Act implementation, when we were not allowed to gather with each other, they tried to stop us from sharing those stories. And we still managed to find ways to share them. And that's why they're still alive today. So it's withstood many attempts to eradicate it throughout history because of those sort of underground meetings that were held, and through that sense of responsibility that we had, that once we learned something, once we heard a story, that responsibility is now passed on to us to pass it on to the next person. And when you think about storytelling and the act of hearing a story, what my grandmother told me one time is, you're going to hear the same story so many times throughout the course of your life, but every single time you hear it, you're going to learn something new from it. You're going to learn something that you need to know at that particular moment in your life. And once you learn that, then you're responsible for passing that on. So throughout oral histories, the interpretations of what we've learned from those stories become ingrained and embedded in us as we're passing them on to the next generations. So when you think about Indigenous traditional knowledge, as we're retelling those stories, we are literally sharing the lessons and the values of 10,000, 13,000, 15,000 years worth of storytelling. And the interpretations and everything that go with it get added to it every time it's retold. ITK also, unfortunately, has a history of commodification by non-Indigenous people. So when we do engage with Indigenous people and we are asking them to share Indigenous traditional knowledge, or ITK, we have to be very, very careful that it is not going to be tokenized or commodified or used to the benefit of the non-Indigenous people without the inclusion and the agreement of the Indigenous community that you're working with. All right, and that's a very important thing to understand as non-Indigenous knowledge keepers and transfers or teachers, is that if we're going to use traditional knowledge, we need to be able to credit where it came from, and we need to understand that there is a responsibility to where you got it from, that it's passed on with the right intentions and not commodified. So one of the things I keep harping on is that we're not all the same. We are very different. And even within Mi'kma'ki, we have different ways of looking at things. So the 7 sacred teachings could be the 7 sacred gifts, depending on which elder you talk to. And you go through a life cycle, and as you're going through your life cycle, you're learning each of these teachings. And as you learn them, you become responsible for them. I was told by my elder that when you start to live by the 7 sacred teachings, you have a responsibility to share them later on with the next generation. And then I talked to another Indigenous elder. Now this was done back in the 1960s by a researcher named Don Ewald. He went around to the different communities and he asked the elders at that time, what would you say a Mi'kmaq value is? And they actually came up with, was it 20 Indigenous values, 20 Mi'kmaq values. And some of them coincide with the 7 sacred teachings, but some of them are different. Right? And it depends on who you talk to, and it depends on where you are within the world. So even within communities, there may be differences between who we are and what we believe in and what we value. I think it's important that we understand that there are differences wherever you go. We are not all the same sitting under that same umbrella. So ITK is everywhere. It's everywhere around us. On this slide where you see songs, that's Jeremy Dutcher. Jeremy Dutcher is Wolastoq from Tobic First Nations. He graduated from Dalhousie's music program, and he put out an album and wound up finding these recordings of our elders that were held on these old tubes that you would put into a machine, and kind of like those music box machines. And as it rolled around, you could hear the ancestors singing some of our songs, and he integrated them into his music. And he actually just recently won the Polaris Prize. I think it was a year or two ago now. But very, very talented songwriter and singer, and opera singer as well. Our knowledge is also embedded and embodied in the ceremonies and the symbols that you see around you. So the symbol that you see here is the Olnu symbol, and it's used in an app called Nui Suri Migmawe Kinamawe. It's our language app that's available for iPhones and what are those other phones called? Samsungs, Androids. I've been an iPhone user forever. But yeah, that's the symbol that you see, and you'll see that around, and you'll also see a lot of the double curve motifs. And double curve motifs actually have different meanings depending on what's on that little centerpiece that pops up. If there's little dots around it, that could represent blueberries. If there's a little arch over it, that could represent the sun. So each of those symbols has a different meaning depending on what context it's being used in. ITK can be found in our stories, right? So the values sometimes are so deeply embedded within the knowledges that it can, you do need to hear it multiple times before you can actually pull out some of those things. And so sometimes stories about animals are not necessarily about animals. There's a story about the crow in our culture that at one time the crow used to be much larger than it is today. It was full of colorful, rainbow-hued plumage that was iridescent and sparkled in the sun. And it had a beautiful, beautiful singing voice. But because he was not humble, and because he did not appreciate what he had, Glooskap changed him. He said, "Oh, show me what you've got." And so the crow said, "Well, I'm going to dance around this fire." And as he danced around the fire, and he's flapping his wings and he's showing off and he's singing beautifully, every time he flapped his wings to show off his plumage, the smoke would billow. And as the smoke billowed out, it started to cover him in soot and ash. And his feathers weren't quite as bright anymore. And Glooskap in the stories, he has the ability to make animals big or large, or to shrink them down to size. And as he kept dancing and he kept getting prouder and prouder and singing, the smoke started to affect his voice. And his voice got hoarser and raspier. And as he walked through, every time he walked around or strutted around the fire, he got shorter and shorter until he became the size that he is today. So that's not necessarily a story about how the crow came to be, but the value in that story is to be humble, right? So we have one of our 7 sacred teachings is humility. So that's a story about humility. So listening to these stories, as you hear them over and over again, you start to pick out the values that you hear. And then there's also, I'm just looking at my notes here, sorry. So there are also stories that are also very, very proprietary, that's the word, proprietary to specific families. So we may know this crow story in my family, but they may not know it in another family. And it depends on where you grow up and who you grew up listening to. Some of the other places where you could find ITK sort of hiding in plain sight, gardening. So gardening, for example, it's associated with tobacco, which is a sacred society concern. It's a sacred medicine for us. Grazing animals also belong to a sacred society, and they may be associated with a number of landmarks spread over hundreds of square miles in a particular tribe's territory. The specialized knowledge of water and the water creatures is associated with ceremonial bundles. So individual elders and knowledge keepers very carefully observe the changes in their landscape and formulate hypotheses about how these things are changing. So a long-term ecological history of the land is actually cloth woven from the threads of stories and ceremonies provided by many different members of the community. And that is a teaching that came from Marie Baptiste, who is also an educator, Mi'kmaq educator from Eskasoni, and an elder, very well respected. And our elders are our knowledge keepers. That's why they're so respected within our communities, because they hold these stories and they bring them forth and they're able to share them with the younger generation so that we can later pass them on when we become elders. So here at the Friendship Center, when I first started doing this type of work, I asked Pam as the ALP instructor, is it okay with you if I start decolonizing our pedagogy? And she said, do it. All right, Pam's very good that way. So all of our lessons are very individualized. Everything that we do with a student is based on exactly what that student needs. And that is not typical of a westernized classroom. Usually, and maybe more so in adult learning, but if you were to go to a high school, everybody's getting the same lesson. They're getting the same homework. They're getting the same test. But here, everything is individualized based on exactly what those students' needs are. The pace is individualized as well. So we might start off with everybody on the same page, but then a week later, we find out that, oh, we've moved forward 3 lessons with this individual, but we're still on the same lesson with this other individual. So the lessons themselves become individualized because of those needs. Our learning is very holistic, where when we develop our lessons, we try very hard to make sure that we are catering them to people who have different learning styles. So we include the auditory, the visual, and the kinesthetic. And after getting to know our students for a little while, we know what's going to work best with each student. We have very solution-focused strategic plans for goals and for work and school and life. And we base those on their specific needs as well. One of the other things that we deal with here at the Friendship Center, which I'm so glad that we have the services that we do as an organization, is many of our students are dealing with a lot of hurdles that aren't necessarily related to their race or their culture. And that's addictions, homelessness, lack of food security, being a single parent, and mental health issues. So with our particular program here at the Friendship Center, we have addiction support, we have a housing team, we also have a food bank, we have a daycare across the street for single parents. As long as there's space available, we can get them in time for school to start at the beginning of the year. And we have a mental health counselor here who can assist. We have many, many other services as well. But those are some of the main ones, the main departments. And then there are multiple programs that come underneath each of those. So we try very hard to meet the students where they're at and provide them with what they need, not just as students, but also just as humans. Other ways that I've used ITK in the classroom is through the integration of storytelling. So a lot of the lessons that I've done with my students include some of the old stories and the lessons and the values that I learned growing up, because now it's my responsibility to pass that on to the next generation. So we've included a lot of storytelling and looking at what other ways can we approach a math lesson, for instance, that doesn't necessarily come out of a textbook, but we know that our ancestors were doing math because they were actually doing research on the numbers of caribou in the area and how that number dwindled through colonization, through the influx of settlers and the impacts on the land. So we no longer have caribou in Nova Scotia. We no longer have moose on the mainland. I think we might have one or two that are hiding very, very, very deeply in the woods. But most of them are up in Cape Breton now. So our elders would have recognized that as it was happening. So they were doing statistical work. It just wasn't called that back then. So there are some different pedagogical differences that I wanted to touch on. Indigenous teachings provide that every child, whether they're Aboriginal or not, is unique in his or her learning capacities, learning styles, and knowledge bases. So some possess certain types of knowledge and some don't. And it's important for us to look at knowledge not as a commodity that can be possessed or controlled, but knowledge as a living thing that is constantly growing, that is always expanding upon what we currently know. And as we look at decolonizing education systems, we have to take a moment to step back and reflect on where did we start and how far have we come? All right, so it takes a little bit of introspection and reflection to undertake that kind of process to say, we're growing and we're learning and we're doing things. We may not be where we want to be, but that's okay because we're still learning how to, right? So one of the things that we look at in terms of Indigenous knowledge is that we value the person's ability to learn independently through observation, listening, and participating. There's very minimum intervention when it comes to traditional ways of teaching. A lot of times when we're teaching our children how to do something, they're watching us as we're doing it. And then eventually they start experimenting and doing it themselves. And we let them make their mistakes because that's how you learn, right? We can talk to them about it as we're doing it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to intervene if we see them making a mistake. So when we look at doing or conducting our classrooms in a decolonized way, it's the teachers who need to adapt to the learner and not the other way around, right? So we become the conduit for knowledge to be transferred, but we do it in a way that's going to work for the learner and not in just our way. So we have to be very flexible in how we run our classes. A lot of Indigenous teachers will allow for a lag period between the lesson and the reflection needed for the students to acquire and accept new knowledge. So we don't expect people to just get it right away. Sometimes it takes a little practice. Sometimes it just takes time to think it over before we can say that that person has actually learned what we wanted to teach them. So one of the tools that I've used many, many times in many different ways is medicine wheel. And now medicine wheels are not Mi'kmaq traditionally. I just want to acknowledge that. They're Anishinaabe and they are from further west as well. The medicine wheels are shared with the thought that this is a tool that a lot of people can use. Now, I've used this as a framework for project development, for evaluations, for assessments, for any moments where I felt like, you know what, I want this to be a holistic thing, or one event doesn't necessarily, it's not a linear timeline that we're following. But say throughout the course of a project, they're going to learn 4 different areas, but it's going to happen holistically, because in the medicine wheels, there is an ebb and a flow between each of those 4 quadrants. You think of water and you dropped something in the water, it's going to have a ripple effect. And that's how the medicine wheel works, is that each of those quadrants actually ripples into the other. And it's a framework for a more holistic way to approach things. So there's also, if you look at the first picture here, this is a medicine wheel that was illustrated in a book in 1922 by George Bird Grinnell. And it was believed that it was the plan for an old Cheyenne medicine lodge. And when they went back to find out exactly what it was, they talked to the Indigenous nations that were in the surrounding areas. And the Sioux and Cheyenne elders attributed it to the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples. There have also been stories about how it was a dwelling for the little people of their culture. There's also stories about how it was the framework for the 4 times in a person's life when you look at infant, youth, adult, and elder. And then there's the cardinal directions that are also included in it. And then that moved on to the 4 direction wheel in the center, which doesn't have any information in it. And then on the right, excuse me, this one here looks at what each of the quadrants represents. And then there's balance found in the center. So depending on where you are in Turtle Island, these different quadrants can represent different things. They can represent different times of a person's life, different medicines, different places or animals. And also depending on where you are, the order of the colors can also change. Here in Mi'kma'ki, when we use it, we put the white quadrant at the top. And the white quadrant at the top represents the elders. And I always think of our elders' hair when I have to sit there and go, which color goes where, right? Well, at the top is the elder's hair, and it's white. So how are we doing for time? I don't have a clock in front of me.
It's 3:20.
Is it? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to, so the next sections of these slides actually go into a little bit more on my research itself and what went into my thesis. But I think at this stage, I'm going to skip through some of these because this is very research based and come to this slide. So in your fields, whether you are educators or administrators, what can you do? Right? How can you help to decolonize your spaces? How do you decolonize your classrooms or the education that you're offering? One of the first steps you need to do is decolonize your mind. So, and that can be a very upsetting and painful experience if you aren't fully aware of the history of colonization. And I just want to put that out there, that it can be a traumatizing experience to go through when you start looking back at history from a non-Western perspective. All right. when you're looking at creating culturally safe spaces, one of the first steps that you go through is to understand what are my own cultural biases, right? So as a non-Indigenous person, how do I see the world? What's my worldview? And how does that impact everybody around me? So sometimes that introspection can be a little bit painful. So I do want to take a moment to just point that out. But I also want to point out something as well. I literally would not be where I am today if somebody in my past hadn't taken an anti-colonizing stance and acknowledged that she did not know everything, but she wanted to create space while she learned for me to be able to find my voice and be able to speak with equity and to feel like I had the power to make a difference. She was an ally. She became my mentor and eventually one of my very best friends as well. But Dr. Heidi Vigen from Dalhousie University, if you ever have an opportunity to see or hear her speak, highly recommend it. She works mainly with Gen Z leadership programming now. But without her saying, we're going to hire you at the BDC, at the Business Development Center at SMU, I wouldn't be where I am today because she gave me some of the best advice while I was there. I started off as a co-op student, meaning I was only supposed to be there for about 12 weeks. And she said, we have a couple of training opportunities that are going to come up. I want you to take every single one of those because I want you to leave here stronger than when you came in. That's an act of allyship. She is a non-Indigenous person who actually made space for me and said, I'm going to give you some extra tools to help you build your skills. So as teachers and instructors, when we start decolonizing our classrooms, we need to make space for our Indigenous and immigrant students and peers and friends. One of the things you might want to do is share what you learn about decolonization and anti-colonization with your non-Indigenous and non-immigrant friends. That can also be a bit of a traumatic experience for some people, especially if the people you're sharing it with aren't ready. All right. Become allies and accomplices in creating decolonized safe spaces and avoid tokenizing marginalized individuals. And that's a statement that we don't always recognize when it's happening, as it's happening, because we think, well, I made space, I gave this person a position here, and I'm giving them work to do, and they are growing their skills. But are they also just the representative of that Indigenous person that you hired? Right? So making sure that if you hire somebody or you're working with somebody, that you're actually treating them as an equal and providing equitable opportunities that they would receive the same exact salaries, promotions, opportunities as somebody who is not individual or Indigenous or an immigrant. It's important to be conscious of that. So these are just some resources, and this is my research on the paradigm that I created, which starts with consultation and research with Indigenous communities. That's a different talk and discussion. But what I really would love to do is open this up for conversation with everybody. And these slides will be shared on the Learning Hub, as well as the bibliography that is included at the very end of it. So if you're looking for materials to read and you're looking for resources, it's included in the PowerPoint. And I've shared that with Marie, and she's going to upload that to the Learning Hub. So yeah, that is my presentation for today. So let's have a conversation.
Thanks, Tammy. I invite anyone to turn on their video if that's easier. Sometimes it's easier to talk face to face in that way. And I invite you to share your thoughts.
They're reflecting. We got to give them time.
I know for me, the point about not intervening gave me shivers. I thought, oh, how do I not intervene? That's my controlling coming out.
I know. I have the same issue. I'm a bit of a control freak, but that's because I actually grew up as an army brat. So things had to be done a very specific way when my father was around, and when my mom was around. She's like, oh yeah, go ahead. You can do that. Just try not to burn yourself.
Tammy, it's Dre. I just wanted to say, unfortunately, I wasn't able to pop on until just after 3, but I'm definitely going to go back and watch it when it gets posted on the hub. As always, the way that you kind of articulate these things is so non-threatening, but also eye-opening. So I really appreciate the opportunity to hear you speak on these ways of decolonizing, and look forward to working with you more so that we can implement that into our own curriculum development and processes at adult education for the Nassau system. So thank you so much for being here today, and I'm going to talk to you more once I go back and watch the first half of the video.
Thanks for coming, Dre.
A really important thing that I think a lot of the CLOs would be a bit jealous of are the wraparound supports offered to the learners, that it's that holistic approach to know that when they're dealing with so many other things, that has to be taken care of as well to allow the learning to happen.
Yeah, we are so lucky to work in such a unique organization here. I've worked in other places where I've never felt so cared for, and that's something that as we do grow as an education department and bring in new instructors, that they have that same type of empathy to our students so that they can recognize when some of these other needs are coming up, and they can get on top of it really quickly and make sure that those wraparound services are implemented as needed rather than when it's too late. So I'm really, really lucky. I love working here, and I'm hoping to retire here eventually.
Hi, it's Courtney McMullen. I loved your presentation. I feel like from my own perspective, my journey in decolonization started when I took a course at the University of Maine at Presque Isle. And David Purley was my professor. I don't know if you recognize him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And it was just an eye-opening experience, and it started me down this path of trying to be the best ally that I can be. Not living in a community with a lot of Indigenous representation, but doing what I can to stick my foot in the door with non-Indigenous people, and sharing lessons and sharing the things that I've learned, and making sure that it doesn't get ignored, and making people uncomfortable sometimes.
It does. And in some of my other talks that I've done, part of my introduction is about a conversation that my mother had to me after I graduated from high school. She said, well, when you go to Nova Scotia to go to university, you don't have to identify as Indigenous, because I am very pale. My father's Irish. And at first, because I was so young at the time, I was actually really offended that she would say that. And then I got to understand that it really was my first sort of view as somebody who has white privilege, even though I identify as Mi'kmaq, my skin and my hair gives me the ability to say I have white privilege. And having that makes it possible for me to get into spaces that my cousins and even my children would have obstacles placed in front of them for. So once I recognized that, I said, oh, well, I can get my foot into door that other people can't. I need to use that to my advantage. And I was having a conversation a little while ago with one of our volunteers, and I explained to her, I said, sometimes I walk into a room and people don't know who I am. So they keep talking, and I overhear a lot of stuff that they may not have wanted me to overhear because they assume that I'm just like them. And then I'll do my introduction, say, "Wait, Nindela we see Tammy Williams, Actoleo we Bokduk, or Akwiki Bokduk," and you can just see the shock on their face. It's like, oh no, I got caught saying something I shouldn't have said. And it's a learning opportunity, right? But like you said, it can also be extremely uncomfortable to go through this process. And that's why, as I was going through those latter slides on being an ally can be uncomfortable because you're actually doing things that go against the Western societal norms, right? You're speaking up against the systemic inequality that has been in place since settlers came here. And that can be really uncomfortable. It can be an uncomfortable place. So if you take that stance as an ally, you have to acknowledge that there's going to be some discomfort with this, right? And you're going to be pushing against the establishment in a lot of ways, right? And that's not always easy for people to do.
Right. No, I'm glad you did mention that it is an uncomfortable position to put other people in, and to kind of acknowledge that that's the experience that they're living, and to approach, your conversations with them knowing that it's going to make them feel a certain way. Yeah. No, thanks, Tammy.
Yeah, no problem. Is that can you? I see a whole bunch of names.
Hi there, Tammy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. We were having mic issues earlier. This is Zach from Can You. First off, just thank you for the talk. It was so incredibly interesting, and it's information that I wish that I've learned more growing up in Nova Scotia. But what I want to mention is what I found particularly interesting is that when you were talking about some of the Indigenous philosophies when it comes to teaching, I think they parallel so nicely with what actually works in a lot of adult classrooms, because that idea of making it student-centered and having it individualized to them, I think it's interesting that we almost need to deinstitutionalize it, because that's why a lot of our adult students struggled the first time around, is how rigid the school system was. So I think incorporating those philosophies in the classroom, regardless of the learner's background, I think that's what's so important. So I just really liked hearing those points that you had about Indigenous learners, or sorry, Indigenous teaching styles.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. When my daughters were little, we moved around a lot when my children were really young, and when we were in between, going back to the States and coming here back to Canada, I homeschooled them for a little while. And when I was homeschooling them, I found this second set of curricula called unschooling. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. This is kind of cool. And basically that's you do your standard ABC 1, 2, 3 math, all of that stuff, but you do it in ways that take you outside of the classroom, right? You go to the museums, you go to the fish petting pool, you go to these different places, and it's not just the standard curriculum that everybody has to follow. And I thought it was such a unique way of teaching that when I did start getting into adult learning programs and teaching adults, I really wanted to integrate that. So we do a lot more kinesthetic and hands-on learning, really based on that type of unschooling philosophy, and then also the decolonized ways that I've learned through Marie Baptiste's books and her writings. So she's a great resource. So if you ever have an opportunity to read her books, highly recommend it if this is an area that you want to explore further. Yeah, thank you so much.
Tammy, would you mind putting the name of the author you just mentioned into the chat, or if Wendy or someone could do that, that would be great. Thanks.
There it is. And she is a Mi'kmaq educator from Escasoni, I believe. Her son is Jaime Baptiste, the one who works with, I think he's an MP. He's in the government now. I am going to post my work email address in the chat because I do realize this is a very heavy duty topic to have to reflect on and absorb. So I'm going to leave my email address here. And if anybody wants to reach out to me because they have questions or comments or they need clarification or they just want to run something by me, then please do so. Okay. And so I know it's funny, it's like give people time to reflect and then we start bombarding you with questions like, please comment, say something, ask me something. Like maybe you don't have the ability to do that yet because you're still taking it in. So in the chat, that's my email address at work. All right. And I'm at the Friendship Center. We are right now currently moving different departments down to our new location down at Brunswick Place. So we'll be right downstairs from the education department. So if anybody's around and they want to even drop in, if I'm available, I'll be happy to talk to you.
You say something about the different terms used, like there's Indigenous, First Nation, Aboriginal, like when do we use which term? What's the appropriate?
So if you're talking about people who are from a certain land, I know personally, I prefer, if we're going to use a generic term to handle everybody who's from Turtle Island, personally, I prefer Indigenous. And a lot of other people that I know do as well. Aboriginal is a government term that was used, that Canada used it, but the Aborigines were also from Australia, but now they're also going by their own tribal designations as well. So if you're talking to somebody and you know that they are Mi'kmaq, use Mi'kmaq. If you're talking about a more general term, I would use Indigenous. And Indigenous is an umbrella term still, even like Aboriginal was used, but it does still incorporate the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. But if you're going to talk about the people who were originally here from the land, then they would be Indigenous to this land. I personally stay away from Aboriginal as much as I can. I've had so much pushback over the years and I've been told that it's just a government term. So I just stopped using it. If I'm able and I'm aware of what nation somebody is from, I will use their specific nation. And if I have the ability to learn what the traditional way to say that particular nation's name in, then I will use that. Right. So we are from Mi'kma'ki. We are actually Olnu from Mi'kma'ki, L''N''U. And it's just been sort of generalized over the years to say we are Mi'kmaq, but we're Olnu people from Mi'kma'ki. and Mi'kma'ki has 7 districts. And yes, thank you, Nuke. But the K sounds like a G, by the way. And I'm also still just learning the language. So it's you're going to come across people who want to be addressed in specific ways. And the second part of this presentation was actually about that engagement piece when you are starting to work with people from different Indigenous nations, is to learn, how do you want to be addressed? How do you want us to have meetings with you? What are the protocols for engagement? Right? And that's the first step that you have to learn. And sometimes you can start that off by doing a little bit of book research, but then you really need to look at, who do I talk to in the community who can help guide me? And how do I compensate them for that guidance? Right? So it's really important to think in terms of research or working with specific communities. How do we engage with them? How do they want to be engaged with? Right? So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Mhm. Well, Alan, Chanel.
I'll just give people another couple minutes. We don't need to belabor it. While we're waiting to see if anyone else wants to ask a question or anything, I will remind you that next week will be our last week for the webinar series. And we're going to have Sue Smiley join us to wrap up the series. And we'll reflect on the year that was, a year that tested our resilience and our optimism and creativity. And the webinar will help us find joy again in the classroom and rediscovering inspiration and self-care. And the webinar is called Helping the Helpers, Recognizing Loss and Restoring Laughter.
I look forward to it, Catherine.
Can anyone just pop on or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for that. This was such a good session. And like, I'm proud of you learning the language. Again. And I also have to prove myself. I'm light-skinned Native. So everywhere I go, I have to speak Mi'kmaq and everything.
Yeah.
And I was raised speaking Mi'kmaq. If I didn't speak
Ah.
it, my grandmother, you guys probably know, Patsy Paul Martin, she wouldn't even answer me if I spoke English. And I remember growing up and going to school, and when she would come drop off my lunch and stuff like that, she would speak Mi'kmaq to me, and I always felt ashamed and embarrassed. And now, like, I wish I can go back and be like, no, like, don't be like that. That's like a part of, being colonized at school. And just like Tammy, I had an advantage of, looking like, non-native. And I noticed a lot of my Mi'kmaq peers and friends, they were treated a little differently in the system. And I always got away with stuff. Like, I would do the same things as them and I would get away with it. And I don't realize that till I'm older. And when I got older, I started thinking like, geez, like, I really did have white privilege. And it's just so important to have, like, be our own allies. Like what you're doing, Tammy, is amazing. Like, we have to do this. And I just want to thank you for that presentation. And I'm just so happy more Ilnuk are getting more involved with education, because that's really where it all starts. It's where all of our kids are. It's where most of our kids are there all day.
Yeah.
So, well, Alan.
Alan, back, Chanel, thank you so much for sharing. We really appreciate it.
last call for anyone. I recall, Tammy, you said you had another meeting that you could go to at 3:30, so we don't want to keep you, but I don't want to cut anyone off either. So.
No, I know. And like I said, if you can't think of anything to say now, but you think of something later on, please feel free to reach out. Yeah, especially being here at the Friendship Center, a big part of what we all do here is working with community, and helping community. And that just doesn't mean Mi'kmaq community members living in Halifax. It means everybody, and we want to educate as many as we can.
Oh,
So don't hesitate.
I forgot to mention when I was just on, I have a positive experience from last week. There was a PD day here on Friday, and I actually did a blanket exercise for the Turtle Elementary for all the staff. And
Wow.
there was about 80 of them. And it turned out really good, and a lot of them learned a lot, and they were just like, wow, like really we've been like misguided and miseducated, and they were so grateful. And but even though those blanket exercises, like they're starting to become into the school for the staff, I just think that's just amazing, because that's a really good start.
Yeah, it is. And it is a powerful experience to go through that blanket exercise.
Yeah.
Even as an Indigenous person, because you're identifying like that was my Grammy, that
Yeah.
was my that was my mom, and when they turn their backs, oh my God, I wept the first time I went through that like a baby. I just sat there. I
It's
just felt
really triggering.
so hard. Yeah, it is.
Like when I'm reading the script, I'm the European, of course. But when I'm reading the script, like the first about 5-6 times I did it, because that's like my side gig. I do blanket exercises for organizations that may have racism or whatever. And the first 6 exercises I did, like I'd be like shouting and being the European, and then like my eyes would be like getting watery, and I'm like, oh, but it's very powerful, like very powerful.
Yeah, if anybody here has not participated in one, please take an opportunity and go through the blanket exercise if you can. Now, normally facilitators will bring Kleenex with them, but bring some of your own just to be on the safe side, because it is really, really emotionally impacting.
It's like you experience it, so it makes it way more powerful. And then all the blankets represent Turtle Island, and then you just see all the land. Anyways, yes, I encourage
Can't give it
anybody.
all away.
Yeah, I'm not gonna give it away. I'll shut up now.
We
Thanks
offered that
again.
at one of our PD conferences, and we went through it, and then I went through it again a couple years later. And the first time you do it, it's all so new, and it is very emotional that you don't take it all in. So you could do that multiple times and still learn new things.
Yeah, just like storytelling, hearing stories over and over again, you're always going to learn something new every time you hear it or every time you participate.
Yeah. My mother, Sunshine Paul Martin, she made her own blanket exercise now. She wrote her own script, and she based it on Elnuk. So it's just in Mi'kmaq without
Oh,
all
wow.
from all over different places. So that was really interesting. We did that about 5 or 6 times, and it's so good. Yeah.
Amazing. So we have a question from Canyu.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Do you see me? Yeah. Hi. I just wanted to make more of a comment. I was just thinking of the blanket exercise, Jane, from that conference. And that's something that will stick with me forever. I thought, like, I have a few Indigenous friends from Ontario, and I've been to some, powwows and really powerful things like that. And I've heard them talk to me about, I've asked lots of questions, and I thought I had a good understanding of the history. And then when I went through the blanket exercise, like I didn't at all. And it was life-changing for me. I loved that, Jane. It was so good. So I just really wanted to comment and say that, I thought I had a good understanding of what happened, but I had no idea. And it is so emotional.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. I'm going to post a link in the chat. There is materials found on the website for Mi'kmaq DeBert that can help instructors when they want to teach about Mi'kmaq people from a Mi'kmaq perspective. I'm just trying to get the link up so that I can share the full thing. And of course, everything's just got super slow on my computer. But let me bring that up and I will definitely do that. Here we go. If it loads. Gonna load. Okay, it's slowly loading here. I think everybody's sending off their last minute emails before they close the doors here. Here we go. So there's some great curriculum materials off of this website, and the resources that go with the curriculum guide are also included on the site as well.
It's me again. I just wanted to take a quick opportunity to encourage people who have developed, adapted, decolonized, indigenized resources to put them up in the learning hub, the resource hub, because we do have a group there so that they can be localized so people can go and find them more easily. So please, things that you've used and that's not just like learning activities, but it could be, you know, background information. It could be people in the community. But if you could share that with people, it will really help us kind of internalize things. So thank you so much.
Yeah. There's a question from Andre. Would you advocate non-Indigenous instructors to use these materials? The materials are there for public use. I would advocate that if you have, and I know most schools don't, but if you have a budget to invite an elder or a Mi'kmaq knowledge keeper, if you're from Mi'kma'ki, to come in and share some of the stories around some of those teachings, then do so. That's what I would advocate for. But the materials themselves are available publicly so that teachers and schools can access them. And they're actually providing resources and materials from the Mi'kmaq perspective, right? So it's not a commodification, and it's not you know, trying to take away from something. You're sharing something that was developed specifically for that purpose. All right. But if you have the opportunity to apply for funding, get some honorarium money pulled together to have guest speakers come in and talk to your students when you do go through like Mi'kmaq History Month, or you're approaching Treaty Day, then ask, right? I always tell people I'm going to shoot for the moon, because what's the worst thing they can say? No? Okay, well, I'll just keep doing what I've always been doing. I'll just, you know, or I'll do it without the money. You know? But yeah, I guess that's how I would respond to that, Andre. I hope that helps. That's right. Shoot for the moon. You will be in the company of stars. I love it. That's great.
Where should people go to ask for someone to come in? Like, is there some recommendations of if you don't even know in your community where you would go?
I would start with looking to what's in your area. So if you're in Truro, call the band office in Millbrook and ask them. If I wanted to approach somebody and ask them to share some teachings, do you have any recommendations from a community level that you would be able to connect me with? I get a ton of requests here at the Friendship Center because we, for whatever reason, our generic email address that just says, when you have a question, click here, comes to education. So I get a lot of requests for people to say, can you come in and do some cultural teachings? And it's like, well, I can put you in touch with somebody who can. And we do have an elder here at the Friendship Center who does that for the Halifax schools and a number of other people. But yeah, check your local communities first and then branch out from there. Because it's usually, you'll usually find a couple of really good recommendations from the band offices or from the local schools. So if there is a CLO or there is a school in that community, you can reach out to them and say, who do you guys call when you want an elder to come in and talk about a specific topic, right? But they don't do it for free, right? So that, like any other type of workshop that you would develop, you want to make sure that you have the funding available to be able to engage them at an equal level, right? And when I say equal level, I mean, like, what would a non-Indigenous male get paid to do that job? That's pretty much the standard that we're trying to follow now, is what would a non-Indigenous male get paid to come in and do that kind of a workshop? Because there's a huge discrepancy, not just between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but also male, female. So it's the best piece of advice I can give there.
Thank you. Did I see someone else's hand go up? I saw one, but maybe
I think
not.
Wendy, was your hand up a minute ago? Or was that telling me that we had like a couple minutes left?
Wasn't me.
Okay. Have a safe drive. See you later.
Great. Well, it's 3:58. People get off 2 minutes early.
Namolta Chanel, thank you so much for sharing, Willalan. Okay, don't think we have any other questions or comments. But I just want to say thank you so much to Jane and Wendy and Marie for being part of the organizers who pulled this together. I love sharing this. As I said, this is my passion area, and I am about to approach a PhD to grow it even further. But this time I'll be looking at prosperity in urban Indigenous communities with family businesses as being part of it. So I'm going to decolonize the crap out of that too.
Lots of work ahead of you, Tammy.
Yeah, just be
It's
busy for a
never-ending.
couple more
Yeah.
years.
Good for you. Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Thank you.